Had to go back for my phone.
No, it's one of those mornings. So no James this morning?
Yeah,
No.
well, good morning, everybody. We are recording, Stephanie?
The record has started.
Okay, good. All right, well, good morning, everybody. This is the normal time of the day when we'd have in the day of the week where we'd have an HRA meeting downstairs with kind of a full agenda, but we've got this work session scheduled today, February 13th, 2025. And so the first thing I'll do is call the meeting to order, and then we'll explain why we're doing it as a work session instead of downstairs too. I think either Stephanie or Bill could handle that topic. So let's call the meeting to order, and Stephanie, you're going to take care of the roll call?
I am. Commissioner Risser? Here. Commissioner Jackson? Here. Commissioner Agnew? Here. Chair Hublin?
Here. And our colleague is in Hawaii. Here. So, all right, so we've got one primary meeting topic this morning, and I'm going to let Stephanie take the introduction, but I think first of all, either you or Bill maybe explain why we're doing this as a work session format instead of downstairs.
Sure. We're doing this as a work session to have more of a dialogue and conversation regarding, this will be the first of a series of 3 work sessions to talk about the direction of affordable housing. We're not asking for any approvals, not asking for anything like that, but more having a dialogue. We have a team of staff here to talk about the various policies and plans that we have that guide staff on housing decisions. And so we wanted to just open it up as just an open discussion.
Yeah, okay, right, good. Bill, any other supplemental thoughts?
Last year, there was a lot of conversations and questions as we considered several items, funding of various items. And so we thought as we started into the new year, it would be helpful to just have some discussions so that staff can have a clearer direction of what direction you want to move the city toward. So this is the first of several that we'll have this year.
Okay, very good. All right, go ahead, Stephanie. I'll let you coordinate everything.
Okay. So as stated, we want to walk you through various policies and plans that have helped guide us and the decisions we made regarding affordable housing and that we presented to you and how we go about creating projects or communicating with developers. And, you know, my preference would be that we go through the full slide deck first and then circle back for questions and comments and conversation. This was a collaborative effort. There are multiple departments and divisions that came together to have the conversation and to help prepare the slide deck and this background information. And we have, you know, subject matter experts here at the table when we get to the discussion part. But 4 of us will be presenting. Marissa will be presenting in lieu of Andrew. He was unable to make it. So what instigated this particular work session? In the budget work plan for 2025, one of the 2 items under livable communities pertains to affordable housing. The other item is related to the comprehensive plan, but that process won't really get started until 2026. So this is really the only one under livable cities for 2025. In order to advance affordable housing goals, including increasing housing options and developing a long-term strategy, we wanted to provide context for how affordable housing or other housing generally is guided by multiple city policies. We will review the policies to ascertain, you know, your commitment to them as they relate to affordable housing. So our goal for the first meeting is, again, to review the policies and see how what the commitment level is or the thought process is of how these different policies and plans relate to affordable housing, because that has come up a lot in meetings that we've had with projects we presented. In meeting 2, we want to talk about the city demographics. You know, review all the census data, review who's living in the city now and what the housing situation is now in the city and how that connects or disconnects with the current population. And in the 3rd meeting, we want to really get some direction. What do you want us to focus on? Home ownership, rental, affordable, attainable, a myriad of all of them, NOAA preservation, just get an idea of the direction and focus that we need to take. And now I will turn this over to Thomas.
Yeah, so I drew the short straw and get to represent the Values Viewfinder team, who is all here today as well. And we often try to ground ourselves in our city's values and pillars, in our day-to-day decision-making and planning efforts. And so we wanted to make sure that we paused here to recognize that we do have these values and pillars that really closely relate to this topic of affordable housing in the city. At the center of affordable housing and our overall goal of community well-being, some of the things that come up are safety, and we see neighborhood stability down there as well, accessible housing options and accessibility, a reduction of stress on our community and residents, an engaged and connected community, connecting back to our pillars, and then again, that social connectedness.
So Thomas, define accessible for me, please.
So in here, we have accessible housing options. So this is, and we'll talk about this a little more coming up, but it's the plethora of housing options available to residents in various stages of their lives, but that also includes accessibility as well. So housing that includes accessibility for those that need it.
Okay, thank you. Next.
Great. So we wanted to dive a little bit deeper into each of the values and how they connect to affordable housing, and particularly some of the past work of the city and how that's connected. So leaning into the values, we'll start at the top. So we have equity, so access to affordable housing throughout the many phases of life minimizes disparities. It creates opportunities, especially for those disproportionately impacted, including people of color, seniors, and people with disabilities. This commitment to equity is reflected in the Human Rights chapter of the Comprehensive Plan and the 2018 Race and Equity Implementation Report. Then we have engagement. Affordable housing fosters a sense of belonging. It builds stable, inclusive communities where everyone feels valued and connected. This sense of community is nurtured through processes like our small area plan processes, the work of the Housing Task Force, and our overall community engagement strategy. Health, as we know, is linked to housing. Safe, affordable housing is actually a social determinant of health. Quality housing improves the well-being of vulnerable populations and strengthens our entire community. This connection is highlighted in the health chapter of our comprehensive plan. We have the value of sustainability, which recognizes the close relationship between affordable housing and climate action. How we build and where we build impacts greenhouse gas emissions. Sustainable, dense housing reduces these emissions while creating more affordable options. These options are often more walkable, have lower utility costs, and are more resilient to climate change. This is a focus of the environment chapter of the comprehensive plan, the climate action plan, and the Resilient Communities Project Density Study. And then lastly, we have stewardship, also a city value, which means responsible resource management. Investing in affordable housing creates sustainable long-term solutions that promote community stability. We demonstrate this stewardship through the use of public subsidy funding, including CDBG, MHFA, LAHCC, and TIF, as well as the work of the Edina Housing Foundation. These investments ensure that we are building a stronger, more equitable future for Edina.
So the framing or scaffolding of how we even began discussing and where we should go with affordable housing has a long history. This slide starts in 2015, but when I started my job, I found newspaper articles and minutes from meetings dating back to the 80s, where affordable housing was a big topic. And I mean, it's evidenced by the creation of the Edina Housing Foundation, which was in the mid-80s, and the creation of Edinburgh and Centennial Lakes, where people were really concerned about increasing housing prices in the city at that time. And so second mortgages were placed on the townhomes and condominiums at those two developments to make those more affordable. And that was in the mid-80s. And then it just accumulated, and okay, those projects were developed, and the issue was still growing and pervasive in the city. So in more recent history, the council approved affordable housing policy in 2015. And this policy really only pertains to multifamily market rate developments, but it has had an impact. And then there's the Racial Equity Implementation Report in 2018, where it talks about housing, talks about access to housing, who has access to housing, and how the city can work towards improving systems to make it more accessible. Then with the budget pillars and values were created in 2018 as well that were just reviewed. I was hired, or my position, not me necessarily, but my position was created in 2018 with the idea that there needed to be a focused approach, that we couldn't just have it happen as a tangential to other efforts, but it needed to be a focused effort. Then, of course, the comprehensive plan in 2020, transportation plan with a chapter within that. The budget values were created in 2020. We had the housing strategy implementation report in 2020, values viewfinder that were reviewed in 2021, and the climate action plan. And all these created a scaffolding for direction and that we've been taking in affordable housing. And one thing that's important that you all know, but just to reiterate, that all of these efforts were done in collaboration with multiple Edina residents. That there was a lot of public input in creating all of these. Committees of volunteers, they happened over many months, many public meetings. Consultants were hired to pay for, the city paid for consultants to help staff and these committees come to the final plans. So there's been a lot of engagement all along the way that came up with all of these. And I think that's just something that's really important to reiterate.
So one of our guiding documents that has a big impact on housing is obviously the comprehensive plan. So every 10 years, the Metropolitan Council comes out with new growth forecasts for employment, population, and household growth for the region. And then they assign an allocation to each community. That's the growth that we have to plan for when we do our comprehensive plan. So we do that by identifying as a fully built out community, what are the areas within Edina where we would allow that growth to happen and at what densities. Similarly, the Met Council determines the regional need for affordable housing units over the next 10 years and assigns an allocation to each community. And we plan for that by guiding sufficient land at certain minimum densities. So for our last comprehensive plan, our affordable housing allocation was the 1,804 units. To date, we've delivered on about 17% of that goal.
Say again?
About 17% of those units have been delivered.
Thank you.
And that goal is by 2030. In some cases, some of our land use challenges that we talk about are sometimes a result of our policies and regulations not always totally being in sync. A couple months ago, we presented the zoning code audit that we did in 2024, and that found that a lot of our zoning regulations are not totally aligned with the goals and policies of our comprehensive plan. Similarly, we talk a lot about the need for more missing middle and more townhomes, but our comprehensive plan isn't really set up to make that easy because there isn't a lot of land in Edina guided for medium density residential development that isn't already medium density. So anytime someone would want to build new townhomes, they have to go through a comprehensive plan amendment process, which, as you know, is a very uncertain and risky process for developers, so that ends up being a barrier. Next slide. And then just some other challenges that you all are aware of, financing. It's more expensive to borrow money today than it was just a few years ago. I think you're all aware of the sewer capacity issues that we have in a good portion of the city that's reflected up there in the area in orange, where we really can't allow any higher density or growth in that area of the city. High land costs, I think of this as somewhat of like a good problem to have, right? Edina has been really successful in creating a place where there's really high demand to be here, but with that comes the challenge of it's more expensive for people to live here if we're not using land efficiently. Some of our own policies and requirements when there's development, like the Southdale design guidelines, can add some costs to development. There's neighborhood resistance to change sometimes. And then also just the risk that, a lot of our current affordable housing is just NOAA, naturally occurring affordable housing, and we're always at risk of losing that at any time due to market conditions.
So, and when the comprehensive plan was working its way through the approval process, the city council created a resident-based task force to focus specifically on housing. And this task force, we had 50 applicants to provide a broad spectrum of opinions, and 7 were selected. And over a course of about 18 months, they met 45 times in public meetings to develop strategies for implementing the housing chapter. And they too, a lot of it was repetitive. We want to protect our single-family neighborhoods, but we need missing middle. We need to increase density along transit corridors. We need to, we support the goal of 1804 new affordable housing units by 2030. So it reiterated a lot of those things that were already in the comprehensive plan, but added a little bit more detail to that. And then this is, as mentioned, we have the affordable housing policy that only does focus on multifamily market rate developments. Nonetheless, it has had a great impact on the creation of affordable housing in the city. And I think it has had ancillary impacts, even though it just focuses on market rate multifamily. Since it's been passed, there's been a lot more movement in the creation of single-family ownership that's affordable and permanently affordable. There's been 3 new 100% affordable multifamily. So I think it helped change the environment to create more affordability generally.
And then for transportation, so the transportation documents that we have don't directly speak to affordable housing, but they are fairly interlinked. And there are several goals within those transportation documents that support less homogeneous development, more increased density. And some of those goals include implementing fully multimodal transportation systems. So that means multiple ways to get around the community outside of just car occupancy. Reducing dependence on those single occupancy vehicles and associated greenhouse gas emissions from those trips. And then supporting alternative transportation options like walking, biking, and transit. We do know as well that low to moderate income households are more dependent on transportation systems outside of cars. So they are taking public transit, they're looking for walking, biking opportunities to move around the community that they live. So creating those affordable housing opportunities near where that transportation modes exist is a really great way to, as we think about developing and expanding the options. And so the map on the right of the screen, those darker areas show a parcel's proximity to transit service. So the darker the parcel, the closer it is to public transit service. And so those lighter colors are places that aren't shaded. They're not close to transit options today with the current system that exists. So as we look at the map today and as we think about expanding opportunities, increasing housing opportunities in the darker areas puts further demand on the system, which we know from Metro Transit, the more demand, increased frequency and services. But then we also know from Metro Transit as well that if a demand exists in a community, they're willing to expand service. The demand has to be there before they're willing to even expand service to a community.
So I'm not going to read this whole slide. You have it. But just to give a summary of the policies and plans, that we do have the affordable housing policy, we have the racial equity implementation report, we have the budget values and pillars, the comprehensive plan, the transportation chapter within the comprehensive plan, the housing strategy implementation report, the values viewfinder, climate action plan, and even the tree ordinance. The tree ordinance does overlap with affordable housing in that it's a great example of how we had 2 objectives. I mean, we have multiple objectives, but within these, there's 2, protecting the tree canopy and supporting affordable housing. So within the tree policy, or the tree ordinance, there is for homes that are valued at less than $500,000, there's a waiver. They don't have to do as much as a home greater than $500,000. So it's a way to show support of affordable housing and a compromise between those 2 objectives. And then I just, some of the other things aside from multifamily that have been created with all these policies as scaffolding, as guardrails that have been supported. Is we have our ownership programs, affordable single-family preservation, because it was stated we want to protect our single-family ownership. And so, but how do we make it so it's more obtainable? come home to Edina, as you know, but that's been suspended. And the preservation, I have affordable single-family preservation under this as well, because it's not building new, it's preserving what we have, but creating those new opportunities. The 4D and energy efficient programs, so again, a collaboration between two objectives that the city has, and our home rehab loans that goes along with that. And then we have the projects that have been created. In blue are the 100% affordable, and in the green are the market rate that have affordable within them. So in future meetings, I just wanted to introduce this idea, is like really trying to pinpoint future direction. Where should we focus our energy, our money, our resources on? What kind of housing is it that you all want staff to focus on? And then to summarize today's goal is, are these existing policies and plans still relevant as they pertain to affordable housing? Are modifications to the policies that we have in place needed? And what vision beyond the budget work plan, what is the vision behind the budget work plan in the context of all these city policies and plans? So that's the end of the presentation. Wanted to set the table.
Just at the very beginning, it struck me that meeting number 1 and meeting number 2 were really carefully linked, and it seems to me that to maybe effectively answer some of these questions that you posited here, that we need to know more. You know, you grounded us in how we got to where we are, but more about the demographics. I mean, there's more in meeting 2 that reflects on what we do relative to the questions you're asking us to answer in meeting 1, I think. So I'm wondering how we kind of navigate that.
Yeah, I think.
I'll just give you an example of what sticks in my mind. You know, we had this issue a couple of years ago now with this. People were concerned about, well, how many kids are coming into the school district that might affect how many kids are at Cornelia School, for example. And we hired Hazel Reinhardt along with the state, along with the school district, the former state demographer, to look at that issue, and she found it in the market rate apartments. So we're, my memory serves me right, 0.1 kid per apartment. So it was a de minimis sort of impact on the school system. But in the affordable housing units, there were kids. And then we found that where she said where the kids are is in single family homes. And the more expensive the home was, the more kids there were. And, what stuck in the back of my mind from that conversation was, to these very points, are we heading in the right direction here? If the kids are in single family homes, and those single family homes are ownership models, should we be thinking more about NOAA, for example, and getting, you know, an extension of that program we do with Walt, where we have the land trust model, and though we've got that underlying question of source of funds, and how do we allocate them, it still seems to me that the demographic part of the conversation is really critical to help guide us on what we should be doing next. I don't know what others' thoughts are, but.
Yeah, that was one of the notes I had, is looking at the demographics, and what was not included in this presentation, I'd like to have, is the Edina workforce. So not necessarily people who live here, but people who work here. I think that's a really important element. And then with the transit map that we had, I'd like some, if possible, to show impact of the E-line coming. It doesn't look like that's part of this map, but I think, you know, if we're going to have high-speed bus rapid transit, I'd like to, you know, have that reflected somehow or other.
I think that is on there.
Yeah,
Is
it's
it?
the
The
red.
red dash line.
Okay,
On the east side of
but I don't understand why it's not dark green all the way along there then. That's like instantly right on it.
Yeah.
And yet it's medium green. So
Due to the current land use, density, allowable density.
No, I don't know why it's shown.
Yeah, we can.
anyways, I just,
Yeah, we can check
it doesn't
with
seem to
Andrew.
jive with the reality of the E-line, so
Yeah.
just a note. So I have a lot of thoughts on this. I'm really, thank you for putting this together. This is a conversation I've wanted to have for quite a while, so thank you. This 1,800 number, I wanna kind of myth bust this a little bit. The algorithm that the Met Council uses relies heavily on the differential between the cost of housing and the salaries in a city, for the workforce in a city. We have the hospital, we have shopping malls, we have the school district are the three biggest employers in our city. I think that's right, Bill. And those are all really low-paying jobs. The cost of a house, median cost of a house is over $700,000. That differential is huge. Therefore, that 1,800 number is very large. That's 100% affordable housing buildings with 180 units each. There's just density that is not feasible in our city. So I really want to myth bust that 1,800 number. I don't want that to be foundational to our decisions, because I think it's an artificial number that doesn't take into account existing land use and the capacity of our city to respond to that. Otherwise, we're going to have, I don't like the path that necessarily takes us down, because it's artificial. I see a disconnect between what all these documents have shown are the needs in the city and the options that have been available to us. The three things that I see we need affordable housing for is workforce housing, and that's 60% of AMI and higher, senior affordable housing, and housing for adults with developmental disabilities. Those are what I've seen as the needs for our city. I think there's a real disconnect between the funding sources available and meeting those needs. And I think that was the task force that James put together, shows sort of, if we want to meet that, we have to have our own bank. I mean, it's just, and he was correct in that. So that's the puzzle that I don't know how to solve, but I see that disconnect between what the needs of our community are and the options that are available for affordable housing. And so that's kind of my goal, is to find ways that we can reconcile those things. So those are my initial thoughts.
Julie, you had.
Yeah, can we go to the summary of policies and plans slide? Where we talk about budget values and pillars, and
This one, or the earlier?
no, that's it right there. And so okay, budget values and pillars. Guide city budgeting decisions. Affordable housing is the primary item within the budget goal for livable city, yet there are no general funds allocated to this effort. And here I'm getting concerned because the general fund is not the purview of this body. We are the HRA, and we do not have the authority to tap those funds in order to provide financial resources for the development arm of the city. And so I'm wondering why that's in there.
All the policies and plans were approved by, well, most of them at any rate, were approved by the city council. So all of these pertain to the city council. But as the housing body, the decision-making for the housing body, that's why we're bringing this work plan to this instead of city council. Plus, it's easier to schedule, quite honestly, at HRA level. So it's just, there's a lot of cross between what the city council does and when actual decisions are being made, we go to the proper body. We go to the city council for decisions that need to be made by city council. We go to the HRA for decisions that need to be made by the HRA. But as far as the policies are concerned, they kind of branch over both.
Policies, right, but financial resources are distinct, and we levy for the general fund as the council. It is a discrete bucket of money, and we levy for the HRA. It's a discrete bucket of money. We could not have council coming to the HRA saying, hey, can you help us build this park building? And we can't have the HRA going to the general fund asking for money for affordable housing.
That is correct, and we're not asking for money today, but, and this whole reason for this work session is because in the budget pillar for 2024-2025 is the work plan is advanced progress to affordable housing goals, including increasing housing options and developing a long-term growth strategy. And that is the budget pillar for the, that was approved by council. But since this is the body that oversees decisions regarding housing, that's why we're bringing it here. But I'm not asking for any money. No one's
I
asking.
mean, there can be no money coming out of the general fund for the HRA. I just want to make absolutely clear that that is understood.
True, yes, that is understood, but when we ask for, projects to get financing for affordable housing, if we're asking for TIF or something else, we go to the city council,
Right, if you're asking for TIF, okay.
or any money.
Any money?
Well, any
The
money that
general
is
fund is for-
controlled by the city.
The general fund is there to fund services and to, I mean, we have a whole mission statement for that. And yes, I mean, the council advances affordable housing goals through different means, but it's not the development arm. And it just, looking at this presentation makes me kind of concerned, because it makes it seem like the ask ultimately is to go to the general fund for financing. And I just want to make sure, because the budget pillars also, it says advance progress to affordable housing goals. That could mean so many different things, including, creating healthy spaces and communities, and that could be a park and rec building. And so I want to say that. And then could we go to the slide where we have the multifamily numbers and the, there, okay. I did go through, and I know your report for compliance was on the consent agenda back in December. And I went through that and I compared it with the compliance report the previous year. And I am getting very concerned because so many of these places are not compliant with our affordable housing policy. And it appears they've been non-compliant for at least 2 years. And we've got the Aria, we've got the Avador, we've got the Lorient, which had been compliant, but then this year is apparently not compliant. The Millennium, and so.
Are you making like a policy recommendation that we enforce compliance more strictly?
I'm getting the sense that it's really not something that, I mean, it's been 2 years. So like and I've talked to people, and the answer I get is sort of, well, it's really hard to get market rate apartments to be compliant, but I don't think we can count them as affordable housing if they're not functioning as affordable housing. And so it's not just how do we get them compliant, but I think it's also this discussion is, where are we headed? And we just approved over 4.8 million for 15 units in a development. I believe it's the same developer that did the Lorient, and we're not getting those affordable units. So if this is a dialogue about where to put money and what to do, I think we need to acknowledge that. And slides like this.
Stephanie, answer that before we go on to, because that's a really good question, and I'd like the answer before the next question gets raised.
Thank you, because I kind of roll.
Yeah, so just stop and let Stephanie answer
yeah.
that, because I'm really interested in her answer.
When the affordable housing policy was first approved, and even prior to it was being approved, the enforcement was pretty soft. As you can see, ARIA is no longer on this map because they and Avador and Aurora were pretty much approved by resolution. There was no redevelopment agreement that required them, or it was in the SIPA, and then once the project is built, there's no teeth left to be able to ongoing enforcement. So it is the bully pulpit, as we have heard said, that would keep them in line. With other projects that have financing, we hold back. We hold back their TIF payment until they're in compliance. And so that is the tool that we've been using to make them comply. If they receive financing from us, like TIF, where there's a semi-annual payment, we don't pay it until all their paperwork's in order. With the ones that at the report in December, we're still working with them. We did not say, oh, you're not compliant now, okay, see you next year. Like Maison Green, there have been probably 50 emails since that December report trying to get them up to compliance. So it's an ongoing, throughout the year process. So the December report is a snapshot in time.
Can I build on that? Because I know that our policy recently changed with like the most recent approvals that we had. And there are no projects that exist under that new policy where we're having the affordability in perpetuity. Do you foresee any different levers that we'll be able to use for those kinds of projects that are under this new kind of governance?
Well, the policy we changed is they must comply with our compliance, and they must cooperate with our compliance. Because we're a statutory city, we are also limited by what kind of hammer we can use when someone is not compliant. We're talking about projects that do not have financing, putting a declaration on them nonetheless. If they get a PUD, I mean, that's where the PUD comes in too, is that the policy only kicks in if there's a PUD or funding. And so for projects that get a PUD but no funding, we are now recording a declaration saying that they have to maintain their affordability. If they don't, we're still kind of like, well, you're not in compliance with your declaration, but whether or not we can fine them or anything else, we're limited by law on what we can do. So it's the projects that have TIF where we have really the strongest lever
During the life of the TIF agreement?
during the life of the TIF.
But this is information we need to get up front when we're making decisions about where to put money. Like, what are the chances that a unit will actually function as an affordable unit? And if we don't have that basic information, we can't be making decisions that are fully informed. Is the Avador now up to compliance?
They have completed their paperwork. And so, yeah, I will report back in April on a follow-up to the December report.
In the report, it says they had until December 16th.
To return some of their paperwork in, and I just haven't received, our compliance officer has multiple cities, and so I just have, and she wants to do it all at once, so we've been waiting a lot for Maison Green to get them. They're the ones that had the most issues, to get them all together, and then we'll do it in one aggregate report rather than piecemeal.
In the interest of just public transparency and us being able to really understand what's going on, it would be helpful when we have maps like this, if you could say when, like for Maison Green, you know, when we started tracking and how many months it's actually been in compliance and how many units have been compliant.
Okay.
Because we're just looking at it and this image makes it seem like, hey, this is fantastic. And so that, I mean, we need to be able, and the public needs to be able to see that.
Question, Julie.
Yeah?
What's the extension of what your point is? I mean, are you suggesting that because enforcement may be an issue that we should abandon policy or change policy?
No,
Or
I'm
should-
saying
is
we
there
need,
are they connected or disconnected in terms of policy and enforcement?
they're connected, however, it's all about creating policy that is informed. And this is kind of the same thing that came up in our talks about the budget, where we got a lot of very general information, but we weren't getting the specifics that we need. And I think in order to have sound policy, we need to have that information. And so I see them interconnected and interdependent. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm just trying to figure out, if you were going to suggest that because we're having some challenges around enforcement based on being a statutory city, that should somehow affect our policy on affordable housing.
I, as a elected official, do not have, and this again kind of goes back to what Member Pierce said at the budget meeting, okay, where he was saying, you know, if you asked me to make cuts to the Cargill budget, I have that knowledge, I could do it, but I don't have the knowledge. We need city staff to figure out what it is that needs to happen to fix this problem. It can't be coming to us. We're not the experts.
If I
And
could
so, yeah.
jump in for a second. So you'd asked to have more information upfront. When we do TIF as an example, the redevelopment agreements have a whole chapter about the number of units, the types of units, and then there's a whole exhibit that's like 40-some pages that has all the compliance details. So that's always in the redevelopment agreements upfront. The challenge is the city council, the HRA will approve a project and funding with the developer that builds the project on year one. 2 years later, the project is finished, they hire a property management company to actually implement it. On the day that we approve the zoning or the financing, they don't know who the property manager is gonna be. So all the information we have, the guidelines, the guardrails, we definitely established that. But I think like the Mason Green, I'll pick on that one as an example. They've had 3 different property managers since that building opened. And I think that's part of the challenge here is they brought in someone, it didn't work out. They brought in someone else, there were some issues. They brought in a 3rd person. Meanwhile, Stephanie and the compliance agency that we use has been working with each one to get them off to the good start. And then 2 months later they leave, so they do it again. So I think that's why that one's had a bunch of bumps in the road. But when we approved that project, when you approved that project in 2021, who could forecast that there'd be such turmoil in the property management industry? So we provide as much information as we can to make your decision, but the first couple years of a project are always the rockiest. Once they stabilize, it's a whole lot easier. They've got patterns in place, they have systems in place. Stephanie and the Affordable Housing Connections do a great job of giving them the rules on day one. And then we remind them, give this to your property manager. When you're interviewing your property manager, let them know these are the rules for these 10 units or whatever. But yet, this is just how the industry works. The first years are rocky.
But it sounds like it's not just the first years. Like the Lorient was compliant and slipped out of compliancy. So it's like this ongoing thing. And I want to push back a little bit on the TIF agreement because we don't get anything about square footage. In the last TIF agreement that we did, there's language that one person can change the makeup of what we're getting. And there isn't even a clause that says that that person has to report back to council or the HRA. And that's Manager Neal, Executive Director Neal. So there's a lot of ambiguity and we're spending millions and we're not, I mean, just, and I know it's hard, but just, you know, and I'm trying to put, this has got to be really frustrating, you know, from a staff perspective, but, you know, also from an elected official perspective. We need to be the stewards and we are accountable to the residents. And I need to be able to say the next time there's a multifamily that comes up, like, are we ever going to see affordable housing units? And when I do the comparisons of the 2 compliance reports, what are the chances? You know, so there's that, but I'm sure my colleagues probably have other things they want to talk about. So let's.
We can add that to the list of
Yeah.
things to talk about in more detail as we go along here.
So I kind of want to build off of Commissioner Jackson.
You can call me Carolyn. It works.
Carolyn was saying of like the 1804 number is maybe not the North Star that we should be guiding towards. And what I think would be helpful is maybe getting more in the weeds. And I know that, you know, you never want us to be too far in the weeds, but having more tactical, attainable goals that we set that's a little bit more specific. And so a couple of examples, right? I think, Carolyn, yours with, you know, housing for adults with developmental disabilities. Like that's something more tactical, measurable that we can go towards. Things that are specific to workforce housing with teachers, nurses, officers, whatever it might be of people who work in the community and wanting to ensure we have housing for them. I really appreciate what the mayor was saying about like looking at the demographics, because my fear is always, do we have enough kids in the schools to maintain the funding, maintain that enrollment number? So should we be prioritizing kid-friendly or kid-focused kind of housing. And, right, we know that potentially because of the 0.1 per unit, that maybe just like this strictly market rate, multi-unit housing doesn't align with that. The other one is, you know, we talked about the walkability, the sustainability. Should we look at, you know, like a tiny home village that focuses on that sustainability, completely green, in a hyper-local kind of node where we can also focus on the walkability component as well. And so I think taking what had been more of a macro level view, and I know that sometimes our hands are kind of tied, like we're not gonna be going out and like actually building this ourselves, we're dependent on developers. But I think being a couple steps more specific, and I think that's partially what you're asking for as well, I think will help us in meeting those goals better. And I think it's also partially what we're hearing from members of the community is like, we don't wanna just fund affordable housing in some cases, but where are there specific projects that we can really garner some support and excitement around, I think would be helpful. And then I always, and kind of going back to that matrix that was provided, love looking at ownership opportunities, and so I think that will continue to be a focus. And I understand that can't be 100% necessarily of what we do, in terms of like the city as a whole, but I think continuing to focus on those opportunities will really be key. Because I go back to, I forget what it was called, I think it was engagement on one of the first couple of slides, where we talk about inclusivity and like bringing people together. And I just think of like schools and like school-age kids and what does that mean? And I really want to ensure that like we're setting the people up for success that we're bringing into the community. And kind of where I'm going with that, like without being as specific, is like I've observed some of the otherness of like, oh, you come from that part of the city, or oh, you're in that housing, you're other. And so how can we really stitch things together and not just create housing that is other housing?
Do you mind if I follow up on that?
Yeah, go ahead, and then I'll give a few.
Yeah,
thoughts.
so two things to follow up on that. Had an interesting conversation last night about the housing market and how many people, how many seniors are staying in their homes even though they can't keep them up and everything because of the interest rates and the cost. So related to bringing kids in is providing that alternative housing for seniors. I think there are a lot of people who would like to leave their home. They don't want to lose a ton of money to do that. And then one type of housing that I learned about there's a need for is recovery housing for people at the hospital. And that's a real specific need. They need someone, they're not ready to go home yet because their home needs to be retrofitted or whatever. But the hospital is keeping them in hospital beds, which is extremely expensive. And so Fairview Hospital needs that type of housing. So just to put that out as a data point.
Who told you that?
The guy who presented to the Chamber of Commerce had a sunrise breakfast with Fairview Hospital. And he's actually the head of nursing, but then I followed up with their community engagement fellow whose name escapes me.
They're taught between Aurora and not 7,500 yards, but we have these transitional care facilities.
Yeah, transitional care, and they've got a shortage of that.
Yeah.
So that's.
I didn't have a sense of that, so that's interesting.
Yeah, yeah.
And I don't think, yeah, that's a different question from affordable housing, I think, but.
Yes, but it's a
Transitional care.
housing need that we have that we
Like
don't have.
Aurora in France provides transitional care.
Exactly,
They
yeah.
wheel them down the Skyway and then.
Yeah, yeah, so, but, you know, whether we wanna follow up on that, it's a data point that I've learned, so.
I'm not sure that the Met Council is that sophisticated in the way you went about analyzing the housing need, because when I've been in these meetings with them, they talk about, well, there's gonna be 600,000 more people here by 2050. You know, where are they going? Who's getting what percentage? And if you even look at their website, and they talk about, we use Edina as an example, well, your share is 1,800. It's just it's a per population allocation. They just sort of randomly at least in my opinion, just kind of randomly you decide that, okay, based on your population, you're gonna take X percent of these people. But they also say this is just, it's not a mandate. They don't have any ability to mandate anything. It's a goal. And they talk on their website about how it's probably not achievable. But here, we just want you to understand the potential scope of the problem. And we've had some really good, I think, some really good conversation this morning around, well, what are these areas of concentration that we think are important to our town? I think Kate did a good job of talking about, and Carolyn, some of these things that, you know, we think are important, because when you, I mean, years ago, when I first got to be mayor, Palenti was the governor, and I don't know how I ended up on this task force, but it was a state task force on housing, the connection between housing, jobs, and transportation. And we worked for months. Tim Marks, who ran Catholic Charities, he was then the head of Minnesota Housing Finance. We were all over the country looking at how cities and areas go about creating that connection between housing, jobs, and transportation, that triangulation. And the report went on the shelf at Minnesota Housing Finance, never to be seen again. So it might be something worth trying to resurrect, or at least find it and look at it. I mean, we were in Utah. I remember all the different places we went to look at different options on the connection, how to create that logical connection between transportation, which are the things we've talked about this morning, that effective triangulation between jobs, housing, and transportation system needs. And so if we settle in on some areas that we think are important to our town, seniors, people with disabilities, workforce, families, that seems to be an interesting sort of direction. You know, Carolyn says alternative housing for seniors. That's an interesting thought there too. So you get this, to me it's a bit circular. I mean, we don't even really have a source of funds for anything anymore, because we've exhausted basically what we have on projects that were totally dedicated to housing affordability, like Amundsen Flats and the Sound. And we've done it in market rate multifamily. Your heart kind of sinks when you see that Kerr Swenson, our former colleague, has announced that they have to suspend the Come Home to Edina program. It's been so successful. We got the only really definitive source of funds that we got coming in now is that LAHA money, I think, isn't it? And that's what he got that estimated at, $600,000 a year. Well, how do we, this is maybe a question for you, how are we going to go about aligning what we think our interests are with what we think the potential sources of funds are? Is that a conversation yet to be held? You're trying to define the direction first and then look at funds, potential source of funds?
Yeah, it's an iterative process. I mean, 18 months ago, about June-ish, when Commissioner Pierce had concluded his year-long work with trying to find sustainable, affordable housing funding sources, you know, their strategy of sorts was presented as concept to see whether or not there's interest in exploring those concepts further. And at the time, there didn't seem to be. So the only ones that we know of, short of those strategies, are the LAHA, which is about 600. I applied for some Met Council funds and received them to help Walt and Habitat. I'm applying for now matching trust fund money. It's $225,000, so that's one Walt house. I mean, these are the scale in which we're talking about that's out there. So I'm writing that application right now. A lot of effort for little money that will support one house. So, I mean, there's tools the city could employ. I don't want to mention them right now. I mean, we can talk about them, but they are the ones that were mentioned 18 months ago.
And what I recall from that was we're open to it generally, maybe some of us more than others, but we wanted to know what would it be going for. So we wanted to do more of that matching of a detailed strategy with then the funding sources. And so I think that's where now, as we're like tweaking potentially the policy or our strategy as a city, I think it makes it an easier story to then tie it to the benefits and to be able to start to evaluate a little bit more of that ROI. If we can go in and we can talk about the specificity of, here are some of our North Stars and the value to the city and kind of what we've been talking about of how do we start to get at this ROI? You might not be able to do it when you just say 1,800 units. But with a little bit more in the weeds, I think we can tie it better. And it's a different story, it's a different conversation when we have that conversation.
One of my concerns, you know, and I was really happy to attend, it was the 2025 Regional Legislative Breakfast last Friday, and it was all about affordable housing and seeing what other communities are doing, and I'd be happy to share my folder with you all, but one thing that really struck me, and I sat at a table with a woman who was part of the fundraising arm in Minnetonka, okay, and so it's not just the city and the taxpayer dollars that are going to affordable housing. There is a very robust fundraising arm, and we don't really have that here. And I think that puts a lot of pressure on residents. And when I think back 18 months ago, one of the things that people were really concerned about is that you do have people, seniors in fixed income, on fixed incomes, who are gonna see a reduction in what they could get if they sold their home, and there was this deed tax that was added to it, and would they have the resources they were counting on? And I think what is concerning is we're not necessarily looking at total cost when we come up with these ideas and who is gonna get hit and how is that gonna happen. And so that's important. The other thing, you know, we talk about naturally occurring affordable housing and how important that is. And at this event, one of the things they were saying is, you know, it really is important to stress ownership opportunities and not so much rentals. But, you know, I look at what we do for NOAA, and we do some really great things for NOAA, but at the same time, we'll have a naturally occurring affordable house that the market has not torn down, it still stands. And the ask will be, can we rezone this so we can build townhomes that are $700,000 or $800,000? And that gets support from affordable housing. And I think that really, you know, and when we talk about threats to NOAA, it can't just be limited to the market. It also has to be including these efforts that we're taking to do densification, because densification is not resulting in affordable housing. It's resulting in more 700 and 800 or even million plus housing. So there's that. The other thing is they were talking about Bloomington and what Bloomington does, and they have a 9% affordable housing policy for their new multifamily. And, you know, how did we land on the 10% for Edina? And I'm wondering, because the proposal was to lower it to 8 for a recent project. And I don't, you know, and so how, if we've got these policies, but we're not upholding them or we're being asked to diminish them, then I think that is a little bit rattling for residents. And we need to figure out, you know, for Edina, given I'm very intrigued by what Carolyn said about, you know, this false narrative and the Met Council and the numbers and everything. You know, we need to be very strategic in terms of the initiatives we're signing on for. And somebody, I can't remember who it was saying, you know, we used to get 5% all the time, and there was no money that had to go for that. So I don't know if that, maybe that's not.
No, that's not accurate.
Okay, that's not accurate, okay, but.
All we have is the bully pulpit, we'd get a few units here, a few units there, and
Okay.
Stephanie's got a good chart on that.
All right, so, but what, how do we get a number that will actually, work, I think is an issue. But the other thing is, I think we need to count our successes. That hotel that is being transformed, that is huge.
Yeah.
And that's a private, that's not gonna require any funds. That is amazing that that is happening. And so, that's important.
So can I go back to your initial point about the fundraising arm? In all fairness to Member Pierce, his proposal was to get a bulk of public money, which would then allow private investment as well. So he saw, if I remember correctly, it was about $40 million of public money, which would then be supplemented to a $100 million fund with investments, but that they needed that core public money in order to do that. So that was his long-term vision, was to create a fund which could then attract private funds as well. And so that has been talked about. It's just raising $40 million. It's just a jaw-dropping thing to do. And so that kind of stopped right there. But that was his big vision, was to incorporate private funds as well. And we also have the Edina Housing Foundation, which we haven't used as a fundraising arm, but it is adjacent to our work.
That revenue raising issue, we did talk about that at length, and it was that transfer tax, and I think we all just thought that was not a good idea. That was, we're willing to talk about, to your point, sources of funds for doing the things that we think are important to do, whether it's a modification of our existing policy or whatever it might be, but we weren't willing to, as a council or an HRA, to recommend to the council the transfer tax idea, which I think got advanced in that task force through one of the members. Yeah, so Julie's right. I mean, the whole state is, the whole country, the whole world is working on this production and affordability problem. And I suppose we think it's a little unique in Edina because our land is so expensive. Our properties are so expensive. And it does create another dimension of difficulty that the city might not have if it has a lot of greenfield. But even in cities that have greenfield, like Prior Lake, or I guess Maple Grove to a lesser extent, they can't get the builders to build the kinds of houses that are affordable because nobody wants those houses, is what they're saying.
Yeah.
So it's the market.
Yeah. They were saying it cost $440,000 for this development in Chanhassen, and the cash flow was for $400,000. So like just by building these apartments, and they were market rate, already there was a $40,000 per unit deficit. So
yeah, the exaggerated example of that was presented by the panel at the MLC meeting last Friday from Minnetonka.
Okay.
They did 10 townhouse units. The per unit subsidy was $700,000. Wow. The subsidy.
The subsidy. That's crazy.
To create affordable housing units. So now what they did is they got permission from the legislature. There were a handful of cities, I think, that got permission from the legislature to use leftover TIF funds to aggregate them and use them for affordable housing, and that's the way they were able to do it. But still, the subsidization level was staggering.
Yeah.
And it's unsustainable.
Yeah.
So what do we do? As we go about trying to address this challenge in our town and more broadly.
I think that's really where we need more of the creative ideas. It can't just be continued sprawl of the single-family house, which is what you get when you're thinking about Prior Lake or some of those other areas, because they have the land, and so it continues to sprawl. But then you have the transportation issues, you have all these other components. So I think we need to really be creative and almost go back to the drawing board in a lot of ways, which is hard to do with zoning laws and kind of the existing footprint of cities that we have within Edina here.
If we said workforce housing was a primary emphasis of ours, and just by way of example, and we looked at that triangulation issue, that we're going to figure out a way to provide housing for workforce personnel and connect those jobs, connect them to their jobs easily through a system of transportation that didn't require them to even take public transportation. They could walk.
Right.
Then you start things started getting concentrated in a hurry in the Southdale district, and we got a lot of density there already, you know, so that has its own think-through sort of issues. That's where would you put it to try to achieve those goals of connectivity and minimizing, as Bear says, the greenhouse gas effect of everything. And we don't really have an effective public transportation system in Edina yet. You know, we could do it ourselves, but we haven't decided to go in the bus business. We got that authority from the legislature to have our own bus system.
Didn't know
Years
that.
ago, when they did Centennial Lakes, we got the authority to have our own bus system.
I would not make that
I suppose we could start the, yeah, we could do the little compressed natural, or CNG trolleys running around Oakdale District. That's another.
But it is tied, right? Like, we need to be thinking about transportation as we're
We do.
making some of these informed decisions and looking at where are there those opportunities, which is why I really like that map from the U of M
Yes.
study that was done, because that helps in that prioritization.
Another good example was Julie raised. It was, we just had those young guys in front of us a week ago or so that wanted to put the 4 townhouses over on Vernon Avenue. It started out as, and you had a letter in there in support of it. And we asked them, well, what's the range of cost? And it was gonna be $8 to $9.50. And that apparently is the new missing middle in Edina. I don't know.
It's built on slab. It's
Yeah,
not.
built slab on grade.
Right, but, and that was a situation where they were meeting every single setback requirement. They were not needing dramatic variances. And I think, you know, if that's the cost for something that meets the code requirements, when we grant huge setback variances, we're making it harder to encourage smaller homes that might go for more modest prices. And so one thing we could do is be more consistent when it comes to enforcing the standards that are on the books. And that might encourage smaller, more affordable homes.
I just think the cost of construction right now
Yeah.
is just, it's, you can't overcome that.
You can't.
With zoning will not fix the cost of
That's right.
construction.
I think
It
we
doesn't
should
matter what the
abandon
zoning is, it's just,
the new construction notion for ownership, single family. I don't
Yeah.
even think we should have that in our, I mean, there's data around that. The meetings I've been in on a metro-wide basis, the data show clearly that you're much better off getting a bang for the buck out of NOAA than you are out of trying to do new construction.
They emphasized that at the meeting where we were. And so, you know, I would really like us to think when we're rezoning and this, you know, moving toward townhomes, we're not getting affordability. And I think, you know, one of the things that we could be focusing on is what can we do to ensure that we're not making decisions that will undermine affordable housing? And I think that, yeah,
Sorry. I thought you were-
okay, no, that's good.
I think it's easy to look at a specific project like that and say, oh, well, they're tearing down one potentially NOAA house and bringing in 4 that are not cheap, right? Not affordable. But I think that the other component is when we look at the city as a whole and the number of units, you get the impact on supply and demand. And so by having more supply, it helps at that level of, I mean, what are we looking at? Just a few years before the average home price is $1 million. That's because we are, for the most part, supply constrained. And so as we infuse additional units of housing, it helps to abate some of that increase. And so I think it's hard to say like, oh, well, there was no impact on affordability, because it is harder to measure at some of those macro trends and levels.
But we are, as we take that approach, we are losing NOAA.
I mean, I think you could argue either way, and like, they bought the lot and they were planning on doing something there.
Right.
What's to say they wouldn't just build a $2.5 million house either?
When people
You
that
could
move
say-
into that housing are now not competing for other housing.
Yeah, thank you.
I look at my neighborhood where we have smaller, more affordable, modest homes that have a single car garage. And I walk the street and I just think this is not gonna be here. It's gonna be wiped out by $800, $900 homes with big garages.
That's even probably small.
I'd say that's you're underpricing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
1.5 to
probably.
2.
No, but I mean, I think if we just look at it and say, well, prices will fall if we add density. If Edina was not as small as it is and located where it is, maybe that would be true, but I don't see the logic of that. And I do get concerned when it seems like we will sacrifice Noah to add another unit. And I guess
Well, and I don't think prices will
yeah.
fall. I think that they will not increase as quickly.
So let me just take this in, this is a really interesting discussion, but why, I'm seeing this as playing cards. So each card represents a type of housing. And so how are we going to deal the cards? And excuse me for, I'm forming this as I'm talking. So, but you have townhomes, you have existing small single-family homes, you have apartments, you have market rate apartments. So I would like to see this as a deck of cards, and that's what the grid is that Stephanie put together. It's another way of visualizing it. And so we're gonna look at each box in that grid, I think of them as cards or as boxes in the grid, and say, okay, this is the box we wanna focus on. And to your point, is one of the boxes is preserving small single-family homes. And we could put 100% of our energy into that. But that's where I think we're going with this conversation, is to take that grid and look at the different boxes and say, where do we want to put our resources, our policies and things? And I'm hearing a very strong voice for small single-family homes to preserve them. That's an option, and that's on that grid. So I think eventually, when we're done with this conversation, we'll be able to look at that grid and say, this is an ace, this is a 2. You know, this is a king, this is a 7. Kind of things like that. So applying some values to what are now blank cards. Does that help?
Yeah,
I like the bucket analogy more than the cards, but
Okay.
yeah.
I think it's a really good visual, and then in that process, you know, I'm sitting here making assertions. Well, it's a lot, because I've heard this, is that you know, the notion of building new is a lot more expensive than providing affordable housing than fixing up something that exists. The no idea, but so we should have data on that. You know, I mean, on the grid or on Carolyn's playing cards, whatever you want to say. Okay, you want to do NOAA, here's what the average cost has been for you to take a house, buy it, fix it up, put it in a land trust, resell it.
And I will say, since you all awarded trust fund money to Habitat and Homes Within Reach, between 2007 and 2020, we were averaging about 1 land trust home every 16 months. Since 2020, when more money was put in, we've added 14. So, but the problem is, somewhat to Commissioner Risser's point too, is when people have a home, they have free will on who they're going to sell it to, and they have free will of what they're going to do with that home. And so some people have chosen to sell to Homes Within Reach or Habitat. And some people have had those homes have chosen to sell to a developer, and they have the right to do so. And so they then sell to a developer, because the developer will offer cash with no inspection, and then they tear down the home and rebuild it. And so the idea is, unless you're going to impact free will, people can choose to sell and have the home torn down if they so desire. And so the idea of, you know, even duplexes, if you have one 60-foot wide lot, Addison can correct me here, I'm not good with lot sizes in the city. And if one home is built on it, it will have a value of X. If 2 homes are built on it, each of those homes will not have a value of X. They'll have something less than X, because they will be smaller. But the sale of that home, of that NOAA property, we have no control over. We can provide options like, hey, if you want to preserve your home because you have family dreams and you have memories and you are tired of the tear downs, here's an option, although we're running out of money on that. I think we have enough money for like 1 more home. Um,
Don't you do a right of first refusal on those?
Not for the seller. The seller, it's absolutely seller will.
No, but I mean, it's when you go to sell that house in the first place, why can't you get the buyer to make, to commit through a contract that we have the right of first refusal to buy the house back? You don't have to set the price, but whatever the market is bearing, we have the right to at least step up and buy it first before they sell it to a developer.
Oh, if they allow us that right.
No.
No, I'm talking about homes out in
We're
here.
talking
It's part-
apples and oranges.
You are.
So Stephanie's talking about, Carolyn Jackson, wanna sell my home, I can sell it to a developer or to Walt.
Oh, no, she's talking,
And then you're talking about resale, once I've sold it to Walt,
right.
are there
I thought that's what she was
limitations on
talking
that?
about.
No,
Oh,
I
okay.
was talking the ones that are
Yeah.
currently unaffiliated with any
Right.
program.
My-
The Walt ones are, there is definitely, that's a recycle, that's 99 years of affordability.
Yeah.
It's the ones that aren't in the program
Okay,
yet, that are just out there.
Sorry, I missed that.
Yeah, that's okay. It's gonna,
Right.
there's a lot
Thanks
of
for
moving
catching that
parts.
disconnect, I was.
Yeah, well, so we are doing that with the, I'll call it the Walt houses, the Noah houses, where you got a right of first refusal.
We don't have a right of first refusal, there's a ground lease placed on them.
Yeah.
So they have to be sold into affordability for 99 years.
Okay.
But again, the financing for that, I think there's enough funding for 1 or 2 more homes.
But through that program that we've been running through the city, where you say we've got enough for maybe one more, you've been having some people that have said, no, I'd prefer to have my home stay as it is and get fixed up and have a family come in that can afford to be here, as opposed
14
to
so
selling it to
far.
a developer.
14.
Yeah.
But supply's running low. I mean, we're getting to a point where there's far fewer on the market. I've looked at the list of the people that originally contacted me saying, hey, I'm interested in this program. And they and to see what happened to some of those homes that Walt or Habitat didn't buy, a lot of them were torn down. So the supplies, we're fighting time in supply.
And the cost to do one of those each year continues to go up.
Right.
Because of the pent-up demand.
Right, so those homes that 2 years ago were 425 are now 500. And so they're going up every year, and so our gap would be increasing.
Are there any, I'll preface it this way. We got the new fire station going up on 76. We've talked about what to do with that excess land around the fire station. That seems to me to be one of the few places, maybe the only place, where we can help drive affordability. By doing maybe what we did at 4040, I mean, this is just a thought. You hang on to the land, keep the land, you put it on a 99-year lease, and then you allow the construction of, with a housing foundation, of a combination of ownership and rental, or whatever was decided to do there. Do we have any other places in town where we can drive affordability to?
The Grandview site. I mean, the 2 sites that the city has control over are Grandview and the fire station outlot. I had mentioned others, but I was told by Parks Department to not mention them.
But I think we need to get, and this is where, when we come and we have these general conversations and we're sort of blue skying and we don't have a lot of information, that piece of land behind the fire station doesn't have an access road. And we need to know that, and it's a small piece of land. It's like less than, I think you need at least 5 acres in order to create a cartway into a piece of land according to Minnesota state statute. You don't?
The ring road around Fire Station 2 is a ring road.
It's a ring road, and it's not gonna compromise the way the fire station's gonna operate?
It was designed to serve as an access road for the back parcel
Okay,
and to serve the fire station. And then theoretically also to serve if the LA Fitness changes at some point in the future,
okay.
it would function as the road for that property as well. So it certainly is designed to serve the vacant land,
Okay,
which is like 4 acres or so.
Yeah.
Vacant land,
including the wetland area.
the whole thing, yeah.
Yeah, okay, and so there's part of it that is not buildable.
Correct.
And so we need to know what the buildable area is. We need to explore whether maybe I don't know if we've talked to the commercial areas behind it, if they would be willing to purchase it. But I feel like the information we need in order to make informed decisions isn't necessarily flowing to us. And I look, this is a
We're long way
great
from anything on that. I'm
brochure.
sorry I even brought it up as an example,
Well-
because it's just it's a small piece in the big picture.
Right.
We got a big picture problem.
We have a big picture
And I
problem.
diverted us by even mentioning.
But then we also have, like, for example, though, we will launch a project that may have a fatal flaw. Like when we talked about Solem and the community, you know, we ended up having these meetings and then this neighborhood opposition to the project and all of that. And then in the end, after all this time and energy and kind of negative feedback, we have the aha moment that, oh, we can't do it because of the sewer cost. And that was a known.
That
And-
was
and we
outside,
should've-
Discussion.
yeah, that was outside the city discussion, that was on the developer, I
But-
would say.
But the developer had come with a for-profit project before, and so there was city awareness of that, because that project didn't move forward because of the sewer.
It was a part of discussion the whole time, though. The initial proposal, they'd come with a potential agreement from Minnetonka.
Right.
So it was always a part of the discussion. It wasn't a last minute, oh, we forgot about this.
It wasn't in because I've watched those meetings, it wasn't brought up at the meeting, the two meetings that we had, and then it was sort of, I mean, it was referenced very
So-
briefly, but the impact of that.
Let's, if you don't mind, I wanna go forward looking. I understand your point that we need information, that's a very good point. Mr. Mayor, to your point about all the stuff that you've seen at the national level and everything, how can we articulate this big disconnect between the cost of building housing and what's possible? Because I think, you know, we can come up with all sorts of clever ideas, but then we're always gonna hit that wall of cost. I don't know how to visualize that. Do you have any? It just seems like I see it as sort of this dark cloud over everything we're saying, that it, you know, we want this, but the costs are so high and the barriers.
Right, you know, to your point, this may be a conversation in the abstract.
Yeah, exactly.
Because of the point Julie made early on, we were already working on how to get our budget in a position where it's sustainable over time. And to add another layer of obligation to the taxpayers is something that we haven't even talked about yet. So, yeah, I don't see anybody being able to figure this out. And as the legislature, you know, last year they thought, well, we'll solve this problem by just taking over land use.
Yeah.
And preempting cities on their own land use, and we'll just do the Minneapolis plan.
Right.
And force every city to allow 8-plexes, 6-plexes, and 4-plexes, and duplexes in single-family neighborhoods.
Yeah.
And that's where everybody got amped up, because we want to protect the integrity of our single-family neighborhoods. So, and then the Minnesota Housing Finance, I understand, Stephanie may know more about this than I do, but although the legislature in 2023 put I think $1.3 billion into housing, it's said kind of, their money, their area concentration is different from ours. Yeah. They're thinking about people coming out of homelessness and people from there to 30% of AMI. We're sitting here this morning talking about workforce housing, people with disabilities, families to get in the system so that we can regenerate our school population. And so we may not, that's probably not a source of funds, you know, the state.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's a great question.
Yeah.
You know? I mean, we're gonna have this conversation at the end of the day, it doesn't go anywhere.
Yeah.
It goes on the shelf like that thing I worked on for a year
Yeah.
in 2005 or whatever it was.
Yeah. It just seems, yeah.
Well, thank you. I think, again, you know, our goal was to just say that affordable housing, as you are well aware, is not an isolated topic. It is tied to multiple policies, multiple objectives, multiple endeavors that you all have put your stamp on. And this is part one. And we will come together in a month, I think March 13th, to share demographics. You know, what is the population of seniors? What is the population of folks that may Anna just pulled some data about the number of folks in Edina that make less than $10,000 a year. And who are our current residents, and what is our current housing supply, $1 million in a few years? And where are there disconnects between who lives here and the cost of housing, and whether or not we need to address who lives here, or whether or not we need to bring different people here to pay for the housing, it just grapple with some of those, but we'll just lay the data out. And try to organize it based on the conversation today. I think we're gonna have to set up some follow-up meetings, to present that.
Please include workforce, and then on an unrelated thing, I was looking at, the census has data on how far people travel to work, and that has changed dramatically over time. So how people get to work and what our workforce is, because, that, again, is a sustainability aspect of it.
Yeah, thank you.
So they are Edina people, even if they're not residents.
Okay. So it'll probably be pretty much the same team in a month, and we'll pull together that data. Because I know that prior to COVID, we had 44,000 people traveling into the city each day for work.
Right.
A lot using single cars.
And the data, just 25% of people in Edina work from home. In the statistic, in the 2020 census it showed. So, and that's a dramatic increase over time. So,
Probably low now.
yeah, it's probably low now. Yeah, so.
Or 40%.
Yeah, well, it'd be interesting to see, if, what data's available on that, so.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, thank you, this is great.
Yeah, thanks. We stand adjourned. In the work session.